The first pale light of dawn crept across Millbrook's sleeping streets, touching the edges of Henry Patterson's front yard like reverent fingers. At 87, Hank's body protested the early hour, but his spirit demanded this ritual. He emerged from his modest two-story home, carrying his weathered watering can, the metal worn smooth by decades of faithful service. The garden waited. Each step across the dewy grass felt deliberate, purposeful. Hank approached the first memorial bed, a carefully arranged cluster of red poppies surrounding a small stone marker. "Morning, Jimmy," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of 6 decades. The marker read simply, PFC James Chen, 19th Infantry Regiment, KIA Hill 255, Korea, October 15th, 1952. Hank's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted a fallen stem. Jimmy had been barely 19, younger than Hank was now when he'd held the boy's hand as he died. The watering can's gentle shower blessed the poppies. Hank could almost see Margaret beside him, her silver hair catching the morning light as she'd helped him plant these flowers 3 years ago. "They're beautiful, Henry," she'd said, her voice already weakened by the cancer that would take her 6 months later. Jimmy would have loved knowing he's remembered this way. Hank moved to the next section, white roses for Sergeant Mike Kowalski, Ruth's son who'd died in Afghanistan. The irony wasn't lost on him that Ruth, now his closest neighbor and fiercest protector, had lost her boy to a different war in a different time. Yet the grief remained the same. The roses had been Margaret's idea. "White for peace," she'd explained, "so they can finally rest." Each bed told a story. Yellow marigolds for Corporal Rodriguez, Marcus's father, who died saving 3 wounded soldiers in Vietnam. Purple irises for Lieutenant Morrison, whose son James now taught military strategy at West Point. The garden wasn't just a collection of plants. It was a living testament to the weight of command, the burden of survival, the sacred trust between soldiers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hank paused at the newest edition, blue delphiniums planted just last month. The marker bore Margaret's name, though she'd never worn a uniform. Margaret Rose Patterson, 1938-2023. Beloved wife, Gold Star sister, keeper of memories. Her brother had died at Normandy before she was old enough to remember him, but she'd carried his memory her entire life. It seemed fitting that she rest here among the warriors she'd honored through her devotion to their survivors. The morning ritual continued, pruning dead blooms, checking for pests, adjusting the small American flags that marked each section. Hank's movements were methodical, almost ceremonial. This wasn't mere gardening, it was communion with the dead, a daily affirmation that their sacrifices wouldn't be forgotten. In a world that seemed increasingly disconnected from the cost of freedom, this quarter-acre of suburban sanctuary stood as his personal memorial wall. As the sun climbed higher, Hank settled onto the small bench Margaret had insisted they install. "You'll want to sit with them sometimes," she'd predicted, "just to feel their company." She'd been right, as always. Here, surrounded by living memorials to fallen friends, Hank felt less alone. The silence of his empty house couldn't touch him here. But as evening shadows lengthened across Millbrook 12 hours later, a different kind of gathering was taking shape 6 blocks away. Tyler Mackenzie slouched against the brick wall behind Morrison's corner store, his anger radiating like heat from summer pavement. At 17, he carried himself with the defensive posture of someone who'd learned early that the world was stacked against him. "Systems rigged," Tyler muttered, crumpling the job rejection letter in his fist. "Third one this week. Nobody wanted to hire a kid from the poor side of town, especially one whose father had walked out when things got tough. His mother worked 2 jobs just to keep their rent current, and Tyler's attempts to help were met with polite dismissals and vague promises to keep his application on file. Devon Wright shifted uncomfortably beside his best friend. At 16, Devon still believed in following rules, in doing the right thing. But Tyler's anger was magnetic, pulling him into orbits of resentment that made his artistic sensibilities recoil, even as his loyalty demanded he follow. "Maybe we should just go home," Devon suggested quietly. "Home to what?" Tyler's voice cracked with frustration. "Mom crying over bills. Another eviction notice, while rich old bastards sit in their perfect houses with their perfect gardens, acting like they built something we can't have." Isabella Santos stepped out of the shadows, her tough exterior masking the exhaustion that came from caring for her grandmother while her parents worked 18-hour days cleaning office buildings. Izzy's grandmother filled her evenings with stories of her late husband's military service, but those tales of honor and sacrifice felt distant from the reality of empty refrigerators and unpaid medical bills. "Tyler's right," Izzy said, though something in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "They don't even see us. We're just invisible kids from the wrong neighborhood." Two other teenagers joined them. Jake Morrison, no relation to the captain, whose father had been laid off from the factory 6 months ago, and Emma Chen, whose family struggled despite her parents' engineering degrees that apparently meant nothing to employers who saw their Asian names and made assumptions. The group moved through Millbrook's quiet streets like a storm system gathering energy. Tyler's resentment fed their collective frustration until rational thought gave way to the kind of reckless momentum that destroys lives in minutes. They passed neat lawns and well-maintained homes, each one representing everything they couldn't have, every opportunity they'd been denied. When they reached Elm Street, Tyler stopped. Hank Patterson's garden spread before them, like a personal insult, acres of carefully tended beauty in a world where they couldn't even find steady work. The small flags and stone markers meant nothing to teenagers who'd never been taught to recognize sacrifice, who saw only privilege where honor lived. "Look at this place," Tyler spat. "Perfect flowers, perfect lawn. Bet he's never worried about rent in his life." Devon felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Tyler, maybe we—" Should what? Keep walking while old men hoard everything good?" Tyler grabbed a fallen branch. "I'm tired of walking." What happened next took less than 5 minutes, but would echo for lifetimes. Tyler led the charge into Hank's memorial garden with the fury of someone who'd confused symbols with systems, beauty with injustice. The others followed, caught in the momentum of misplaced rage. Red poppies scattered like drops of blood across trampled earth. White roses lay broken, their petals crushed into the soil they'd once blessed. Yellow marigolds, purple irises, blue delphiniums, a lifetime of careful cultivation destroyed by teenagers who saw only targets for their pain. Stone markers toppled, small flags torn from their posts. The bench Margaret had loved split down the middle. Devon stopped first, horror washing over him as he realized what they'd done. But by then it was too late. The memorial garden lay in ruins, 60 years of memory desecrated by 5 minutes of thoughtless destruction. They ran, leaving behind evidence of their passage written in destroyed beauty and scattered memories. Tyler's anger carried him 3 blocks before the magnitude of his actions began to penetrate his rage. Behind them, Hank's sanctuary lay violated, waiting for dawn to reveal the full scope of the devastation. The next morning, Hank emerged at his usual hour, watering can in hand. But where ritual once brought comfort, horror now waited. He stood frozen in his doorway, the can slipping from numb fingers to clatter against concrete. His memorial garden, his communion with the dead, his tribute to the fallen, his final gift to Margaret's memory, lay destroyed. Across the street, Mrs. Ruth Kowalski watched through her kitchen window as the old veteran sank to his knees among the ruins. Her son's white roses lay scattered like broken promises. Without hesitation, she reached for her phone. "Officer Williams, you need to get to Hank Patterson's house, now. Someone's destroyed his memorial garden." Her voice shook with an anger that had been building for decades. "And when you find the little bastards who did this, you tell them Ruth Kowalski says they picked the wrong old soldier to mess with." As sirens wailed in the distance, Hank knelt among the ruins of his sanctuary, holding a broken poppy stem with the same tenderness he'd once shown dying soldiers. The sacred had been profaned, but somewhere in his grief-stricken heart, a different kind of battle was about to begin. Marcus Rodriguez's hand tightened on the rope as he finished securing his contractor's equipment to the truck bed. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, but his mind was already calculating drive time to his next job site when his phone buzzed. Ruth Kowalski's name on the display made him pause. The old woman never called unless something was seriously wrong. "Mrs. K, what's—" "Marcus, they destroyed Hank's garden." Her voice carried a fury he'd rarely heard, even from combat veterans. "The memorial garden. Everything. Those little bastards tore it apart like it was nothing." The rope slipped from Marcus's suddenly nerveless fingers. He'd helped Hank plant some of those memorial beds, had stood beside the old sergeant as he'd carefully placed the marker for Marcus's own father. The garden wasn't just landscaping, it was sacred ground, hallowed by memory and tended by love. How bad? The question came out rougher than he intended. Bad, really bad. Patricia Williams is here now, taking pictures, asking questions. But Marcus? Ruth's voice broke slightly. "Hank's just sitting there, holding pieces. He looks lost." Marcus closed his eyes, seeing his old sergeant as he'd been in combat. Unshakable, the anchor that kept young Rangers grounded when the world exploded around them. To imagine Hank broken, defeated by a handful of punk kids, sent something hot and dangerous coursing through Marcus's veins. "I'm coming," he said simply. "Good. And Marcus, call the others. Hank needs his boys." The line went dead, but Marcus was already scrolling through his contacts. The Brotherhood, that's what they'd called themselves after discharge. A network of Rangers who'd served under Hank Patterson across 3 decades, men scattered across the country now, building civilian lives, but bound by something deeper than blood. Captain James Morrison answered on the first ring. "Marcus, what's the situation?" "Someone hit Hank, destroyed his memorial garden." Marcus climbed into his truck, already calculating routes and fuel stops. "I'm mobilizing the Brotherhood." The silence stretched long enough that Marcus checked to see if the call had dropped. When Morrison spoke again, his voice carried the controlled fury of a career military officer. "Understood. I can be there in 6 hours. Who else?" "Working the list now." "Jim, this wasn't random vandalism. They targeted the memorial, his memorial. Copy that. And Marcus, whatever response you're planning, remember, Hank trained us better than that." The call ended, but Marcus understood the warning. Hank had taught them that true strength wasn't about overwhelming force. It was about measured response, about understanding your enemy before you engaged. But right now, with his father's marigolds probably scattered like trash across broken earth, measured response felt like a luxury Marcus couldn't afford. The next call went to David Chen in Seattle, Sarah's cousin and the Brotherhood's communications specialist. David's civilian job involved computer networks, but his military skills made him invaluable for coordinating operations across time zones. "Dave, it's Marcus, Code Shepherd." David's sharp intake of breath told Marcus he understood. Code Shepherd, their emergency signal for when Hank needed the Brotherhood's protection. They'd established it years ago, half joking about the old man's stubborn independence. None of them had imagined they'd actually need to use it. "Roger, how many are we activating? Everyone within 8 hours' drive." They ran, leaving behind evidence of their passage written in destroyed beauty and scattered memories. Tyler's anger carried him 3 blocks before the magnitude of his actions began to penetrate his rage. Behind them, Hank's sanctuary lay violated, waiting for dawn to reveal the full scope of the devastation. The next morning, Hank emerged at his usual hour, watering can in hand. But where ritual once brought comfort, horror now waited. He stood frozen in his doorway, the can slipping from numb fingers to clatter against concrete. His memorial garden, his communion with the dead, his tribute to the fallen, his final gift to Margaret's memory, lay destroyed. Across the street, Mrs. Ruth Kowalski watched through her kitchen window as the old veteran sank to his knees among the ruins. Her son's white roses lay scattered like broken promises. Without hesitation, she reached for her phone. "Officer Williams, you need to get to Hank Patterson's house, now. Someone's destroyed his memorial garden." Her voice shook with an anger that had been building for decades. "And when you find the little bastards who did this, you tell them Ruth Kowalski says they picked the wrong old soldier to mess with." As sirens wailed in the distance, Hank knelt among the ruins of his sanctuary, holding a broken poppy stem with the same tenderness he'd once shown dying soldiers. The sacred had been profaned, but somewhere in his grief-stricken heart, a different kind of battle was about to begin. Marcus Rodriguez's hand tightened on the rope as he finished securing his contractor's equipment to the truck bed. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, but his mind was already calculating drive time to his next job site when his phone buzzed. Ruth Kowalski's name on the display made him pause. The old woman never called unless something was seriously wrong. "Mrs. K, what's—" "Marcus, they destroyed Hank's garden." Her voice carried a fury he'd rarely heard, even from combat veterans. "The memorial garden. Everything. Those little bastards tore it apart like it was nothing." The rope slipped from Marcus's suddenly nerveless fingers. He'd helped Hank plant some of those memorial beds, had stood beside the old sergeant as he'd carefully placed the marker for Marcus's own father. The garden wasn't just landscaping, it was sacred ground, hallowed by memory and tended by love. How bad? The question came out rougher than he intended. Bad, really bad. Patricia Williams is here now, taking pictures, asking questions. But Marcus? Ruth's voice broke slightly. "Hank's just sitting there, holding pieces. He looks lost." Marcus closed his eyes, seeing his old sergeant as he'd been in combat. Unshakable, the anchor that kept young Rangers grounded when the world exploded around them. To imagine Hank broken, defeated by a handful of punk kids, sent something hot and dangerous coursing through Marcus's veins. "I'm coming," he said simply. "Good. And Marcus, call the others. Hank needs his boys." The line went dead, but Marcus was already scrolling through his contacts. The Brotherhood, that's what they'd called themselves after discharge, a network of Rangers who'd served under Hank Patterson across 3 decades, men scattered across the country now, building civilian lives, but bound by something deeper than blood. Captain James Morrison answered on the first ring. "Marcus, what's the situation?" "Someone hit Hank, destroyed his memorial garden." Marcus climbed into his truck, already calculating routes and fuel stops. "I'm mobilizing the Brotherhood." The silence stretched long enough that Marcus checked to see if the call had dropped. When Morrison spoke again, his voice carried the controlled fury of a career military officer. "Understood. I can be there in 6 hours. Who else?" "Working the list now." "Jim, this wasn't random vandalism. They targeted the memorial, his memorial. Copy that. And Marcus, whatever response you're planning, remember, Hank trained us better than that." The call ended, but Marcus understood the warning. Hank had taught them that true strength wasn't about overwhelming force. It was about measured response, about understanding your enemy before you engaged. But right now, with his father's marigolds probably scattered like trash across broken earth, measured response felt like a luxury Marcus couldn't afford. The next call went to David Chen in Seattle, Sarah's cousin and the Brotherhood's communications specialist. David's civilian job involved computer networks, but his military skills made him invaluable for coordinating operations across time zones. "Dave, it's Marcus, code Shepherd." David's sharp intake of breath told Marcus he understood. Code Shepherd, their emergency signal for when Hank needed the Brotherhood's protection. They'd established it years ago, half joking about the old man's stubborn independence. None of them had imagined they'd actually need to use it. "Roger, how many are we activating? Everyone within 8 hours' drive." Marcus's voice tightened. "Jim, you should see what they did. It wasn't random. They targeted the memorials specifically, knocked over markers, destroyed the plants he and Margaret chose for each fallen soldier." Morrison's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. 40 years of military discipline held his emotions in check, but Marcus could see the fury burning beneath the surface. Any indication this was personal? Someone with a grudge against Hank specifically? Negative. Looks like teenage rebellion gone nuclear, economic frustration, generational anger, kids lashing out at symbols of stability they think they can't. A third vehicle joined them, a dust-covered pickup truck that had clearly been driven hard across state lines. Tommy Reeves emerged, his sniper's patience evident in the way he scanned the area before approaching. Behind him came David Chen in a sedan loaded with communications equipment, followed by Mike Santos in a motorcycle that had eaten highway miles like a hungry predator. The parking lot transformed into an impromptu command post. These men had coordinated operations across continents. Setting up in a small-town motel felt almost quaint by comparison. But the stakes were personal now, which made everything more dangerous. "Comms are established," David reported, unpacking equipment. "With practiced efficiency. I've got feeds from local security cameras, social media monitoring for chatter about our arrival, and direct coordination with Patricia Williams. She's keeping us informed without compromising her investigation." Morrison nodded, his strategic mind already working. "We need to see Hank first, assess his emotional state, understand what kind of response he wants from us." He looked at each man in turn. "Remember, we're here to support our sergeant, not to wage war on children. Whatever we do has to honor the man who trained us." Meanwhile, 6 blocks away, social worker Sarah Chen sat across from Tyler Mackenzie in his family's cramped living room. The contrast between the Brotherhood's tactical precision and the teenagers' chaotic panic couldn't have been more stark. Tyler's mother hovered nervously in the kitchen, stealing glances at the woman who'd come to discuss her son's incident. Sarah had seen hundreds of troubled teens over her career, but something about Tyler intrigued her. Despite his defensive posture and carefully maintained anger, she sensed intelligence and even leadership potential beneath the surface. The question was whether that potential could be redirected before it destroyed him. "Tyler," she said quietly, "help me understand what happened last night. Not the official version, your version." Tyler's eyes flicked toward the kitchen, where his mother was pretending not to listen. "Does it matter? We trashed some old guy's garden. Everyone's acting like we burned down a church. Maybe because that's exactly what you did." Sarah's words carried no judgment, just observation. "That garden wasn't decoration, Tyler. It was a memorial. Each plant honored a soldier who died serving our country. When you destroyed it, you desecrated something sacred to people who understand sacrifice." For the first time, Tyler's mask slipped. Sarah saw the moment when understanding hit him, the recognition that his rebellion had crossed a line he hadn't even known existed. But pride and fear kept him from admitting the mistake aloud. "We didn't know," he said finally. "Would it have mattered if you had?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Tyler's instinct was to deflect, to maintain the anger that had protected him from feeling vulnerable, but Sarah's steady gaze demanded honesty. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe, probably not. I was so pissed about everything. Dad leaving, Mom working herself to death, nobody giving us a chance at anything decent. That garden just looked like everything we couldn't have." Sarah made notes, but her attention remained focused on Tyler's face. She was seeing the intelligent, frustrated young man beneath the defensive teenager, the person who could become either a leader or a cautionary tale, depending on what happened next. "Tyler, there are military personnel in town, veterans who served with Mr. Patterson. They're here because someone attacked their family." She let that sink in. These aren't local police you can outsmart or parents you can manipulate. These are people who understand loyalty, honor, and protecting their own. Tyler's phone buzzed with another text from Devon. "Military trucks at the motel. Emma's freaking out. Jake won't answer his phone. We need to figure this out before they find us." "What do they want?" Tyler asked, his voice smaller than he'd intended. "Justice," Sarah replied. "The question is what form that justice will take. That depends partly on you." Across town, Devon Wright sat in his bedroom staring at the sketchpad where he'd been trying to capture his feelings about the previous night. The drawings were dark, violent things, broken flowers, scattered memories, the image of an old man kneeling among ruins. His artistic sensibilities, suppressed during the destruction, now tormented him with vivid representations of what they'd done. His parents had always taught him about right and wrong, about taking responsibility for his actions. But loyalty to Tyler had overridden those lessons in the moment, peer pressure drowning out conscience. Now, with military vehicles prowling Millbrook streets, Devon felt the weight of his choices crushing down like a physical force. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. His mother entered, carrying the expression of a woman who'd raised her son to be better than this. "Devon, honey, we need to talk." The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. Devon's parents had already heard rumors about the memorial garden, about teenagers, about military personnel asking questions. They demanded truth, and Devon, already cracking under the pressure of guilt, gave it to them. "Oh, sweetheart," his mother whispered when he finished. "Do you understand what you've done?" Devon nodded miserably. "We hurt someone who didn't deserve it, someone who was already hurting." His father's voice carried disappointment that cut deeper than anger. "Your grandfather served in Vietnam. That garden could have honored him just as easily. How would you feel if someone destroyed his memorial?" The question shattered Devon's remaining defenses. Tears came then. Not the manipulative crying of a child trying to escape consequences, but the genuine grief of a young man confronting his own capacity for cruelty. At the same time, Isabella Santos sat in her grandmother's kitchen, listening to another story about her late grandfather's military service. But tonight, the familiar tales felt different. Izzy found herself imagining her grandfather among the fallen soldiers honored in Hank Patterson's garden, wondering how she'd feel if someone destroyed a memorial to his sacrifice. "Abuela," she said carefully, "what would happen to someone who hurt a veteran, like really hurt them?" Her grandmother's weathered hands paused in their constant motion. "Why do you ask, Mija?" Izzy couldn't meet her eyes. "Just wondering. Veterans, they take care of each other. It's not just duty, it's love. You hurt one, you hurt them all." Her grandmother's voice carried the weight of experience. "But they also understand forgiveness, mercy. Your grandfather," he always said, "the strongest warriors are the ones who know when not to fight." The words hit Izzy like a physical blow. She'd participated in attacking someone her grandmother would have honored, someone who shared the same values her grandfather had died defending. The tough exterior she'd maintained since childhood began to crack under the weight of genuine shame. As evening approached, Hank Patterson sat in his destroyed garden, surrounded by the brotherhood he'd trained decades ago. The reunion should have been joyful, soldiers coming home to their sergeant. Instead, it felt like a war council, men gathering to plan retribution for an unforgivable offense. Marcus knelt beside his old commander, both men studying the scattered remains of his father's memorial marigolds. "Sarge, just say the word. We can have these kids rounded up in an hour." But Hank's response surprised them all. "And then what, son? We scare a bunch of teenagers into submission. Make them hate veterans even more than they already do." Morrison frowned. "Hank, they desecrated sacred ground. They destroyed the memories of our brothers." "They destroyed flowers, Jim." "The memories are still here." Hank touched his chest. "Still in us. These kids, they're angry, frustrated, lashing out at a world they think doesn't give a damn about them. Sound familiar?" The brotherhood exchanged glances. They'd all been angry young men once, channeling rage into purpose through military service, but none of them had ever attacked memorials to fallen soldiers. "What are you saying, Sarge?" Tommy asked quietly. Hank looked around at the men he'd trained, the sons he'd never had. "I'm saying maybe this is an opportunity. Maybe instead of teaching them to fear us, we teach them to understand us. Show them what honor really means." Marcus felt his protective instincts rebel against the suggestion. "They don't deserve mercy, not after this." "Maybe not," Hank agreed. "But maybe mercy isn't about what they deserve. Maybe it's about who we choose to be." The words hung in the air as darkness fell over Millbrook. Two groups of people, veterans and teenagers, were about to discover whether wisdom could triumph over anger, whether understanding could bridge the gap between generations, and whether the strongest response to destruction was the grace to build something better. The night was young, and the real battle was just beginning. The night was young, and the real battle was just beginning. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the Millbrook Community Center had been transformed into something resembling a military tribunal. Sarah Chen had worked through the night to arrange this meeting, understanding that without controlled contact, the situation could spiral into something far more dangerous. The Rangers arrived first, their presence filling the small room with tactical intensity. Marcus positioned himself near the door. Morrison sat with the bearing of a career officer, while Tommy maintained visual on all entrances. Unconscious discipline. Soldiers who'd never stopped being soldiers. Hank entered with Officer Williams, looking fragile in the harsh fluorescent light. At 87, the weight of violated memories showed in every line of his face, but his eyes held the steady resolve that had carried him through Korean battlefields. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, and every ranger snapped to attention. Not parade ground drill, but the focused readiness of men acknowledging their commander. The teenagers arrived 20 minutes later with mortified parents. Tyler led the group, his natural leadership evident even in defeat. The swagger that had driven him was gone, replaced by hollow awareness of crossing an uncrossable line. Devon followed, clutching his sketchpad, drawings made throughout his sleepless night, images of destruction and remorse he couldn't show anyone. Izzy entered last, her tough exterior intact, but eyes constantly moving toward the Rangers, something about their bearing reminding her of her grandfather's stories. Sarah Chen positioned herself at the table's head. "We're here because actions have consequences. Mr. Patterson, would you like to begin?" Hank studied the 5 teenagers with the attention he'd once given enemy positions. When he spoke, his voice carried history's weight. "2 nights ago, you destroyed something that took me 10 years to build. But it wasn't really 10 years. It was 67. That garden started growing the day I held Jimmy Chen's hand while he died on a Korean hilltop. It grew stronger when I came home and told his parents their 19-year-old boy wouldn't be coming back. Tyler flinched. The name Chen, Sarah's name, Emma's name. The connection hit like ice water. He'd destroyed a memorial to someone's family member, someone's child who'd never grown old enough to make mistakes. Every plant represents a life cut short, Hank continued, filling the room without raising his voice. Sergeant Mike Kowalski, who threw himself on a grenade in Afghanistan. Corporal Rodriguez, who died pulling wounded soldiers to safety in Vietnam. Lieutenant Morrison, who led his men through hell to rescue civilians. Morrison straightened at his father's mention, jaw tightening with decades-controlled emotions. The teenagers were learning this wasn't about flowers, it was about family, sacrifice, memory. You didn't vandalize landscaping, Hank said, eyes moving from one teenager to another. You desecrated a cemetery. You scattered memorials of men who died so you could have the freedom to make the choices that brought you here. Deafening silence followed. Tyler felt his defenses crumbling under understanding's weight. This wasn't rich versus poor. This was honor versus dishonor. Devon broke first. We didn't know. Barely a whisper. We saw the garden and thought it was showing off. Pretty flowers owned by someone who had everything we couldn't. Tears flowed freely. We were angry about stupid stuff, jobs we couldn't. Get bills our parents couldn't pay, and we took it out on people who already sacrificed everything. His sketchpad fell open, revealing drawings from his sleepless night. Broken flowers, scattered markers, an old man among ruins, but also restoration designs, memorial plaques, ways to honor what they'd destroyed. I drew these after, Devon said, voice cracking. I kept seeing what we did, and I started thinking about what we could do instead. Marcus felt his anger wavering, watching the genuine breakdown. This wasn't the defiant punk he'd expected. This was a kid shattered by his actions' magnitude. Tyler watched his friend confess and felt something fundamental shift. Leadership meant responsibility, especially when painful. It was my idea, Tyler said, stronger than Devon but carrying its own regret. They followed because that's what friends do, but I led them wrong. He met Hank's eyes directly. I'm 17 and angry all the time. My father walked out. My mother works 2 jobs just to keep us housed. I see nice things and assume they weren't earned. His hands clenched with frustration at his blindness. I saw your garden and thought it represented everything I couldn't have. I didn't see sacrifice or memory, just another symbol of a world that doesn't care about kids like us. Morrison leaned forward, instructor instincts engaging despite personal anger. And now, what do you see? Tyler's answer came slowly, painfully. I see that I attacked people who understand sacrifice better than I ever will. I destroyed memorials to heroes while complaining about my problems. I'm exactly the kind of person those soldiers died protecting, and I spat on their memory because I was too selfish to look beyond my anger. Even Marcus felt his fury cooling, watching Tyler's genuine breakdown. This wasn't the cocky teenager who'd led the destruction. This was a young man confronting his character's worst aspects. Izzy finally spoke. My grandfather served in Vietnam. He died when I was 5, but my grandmother tells stories about honor, sacrifice, brotherhood. She says the strongest warriors know when not to fight. Her voice cracked. She'd be ashamed of what I did. Hank studied each teenager with the intensity he'd once used, evaluating young soldiers. Anger, fear, pride, genuine remorse warred across their faces. But beneath the surface, potential, raw leadership in Tyler, artistic vision in Devon, moral, strength in Izzy. You've told me what you destroyed, Hank said finally. Now tell me what you're prepared to build. The question caught everyone off guard. Rangers expected judgment, teenagers braced for consequences. But Hank offered something. Unprecedented opportunity. Anything, Tyler said simply. Whatever it takes to make this right. We can't bring back what we destroyed, but maybe we can build something better, something that honors the people we hurt. Morrison's strategic mind engaged despite emotional resistance. These weren't hardened criminals. They were misguided, kids who'd stumbled beyond their understanding. Building requires discipline, Morrison said, sustained effort, not just good intentions. Understanding what you're building and why it matters. Devon looked up hopefully. Could we learn about the soldiers, who they were? Could we build memorials that actually honor them instead of just replacing flowers? Sarah felt the shift, from confrontation toward collaboration. That would mean research, interviewing families, learning military history, months of work, not weekend cleanup. We have time, Tyler said quietly, and we owe everyone that effort. Marcus exchanged glances with Morrison. Easy response was punishment, legal consequences, community service. But the harder path might be transformation. This isn't about forgiveness, Marcus said finally. This is about justice, real justice. You destroyed something sacred. To make that right, you'd have to build something even more sacred. The words settled like a challenge. Everyone understood they stood at a crossroads. One path led to traditional punishment and resentment, the other toward something unprecedented and difficult. Hank looked around at the men he'd trained and the children who'd wronged him. In 87 years, he'd learned the strongest steel was forged in the hottest fire. "All right then," he said quietly. "Let's see what you're made." "All right then," Hank said quietly. "Let's see what you're made of." "No," the words hung in the community center air like a gauntlet thrown down, challenging everyone present to rise above their circumstances and become something better. 2 hours later, the formal meeting had dissolved into smaller conversations, scattered throughout Hank's living room. The transition from institutional confrontation to personal connection felt surreal. Teenagers who'd vandalized his memorial now sat surrounded by decades of military photographs, service medals, and the quiet dignity of a life lived in honor. Captain Morrison found himself drawn to Devon, recognizing something familiar in the young artist's tortured sketches. The boy's drawings revealed a mind that processed emotion through visual expression, not unlike the tactical sketches Morrison used to plan operations but channeled toward beauty instead of destruction. "You've got real talent," Morrison said, studying Devon's restoration designs. "But talent without discipline is just chaos with potential." Devon looked up from his sketchpad, hope flickering in his eyes. "Could you teach me, not just about art but about honor, about what it means to build something worth protecting?" Morrison felt an unexpected stirring of paternal instinct. His own children were grown and distant, success in military leadership somehow translating to failure in fatherhood. Maybe this broken teenager represented a chance at redemption for both of them. "Honor isn't complicated," Morrison said, settling into the chair beside Devon. "It's about doing the right thing when no one's watching, when it's hard, when it costs you something. Your grandfather understood that." "My grandfather," Devon frowned. "Lieutenant David Wright, 82nd Airborne, died at Normandy 3 days after D-Day." Morrison's voice carried the weight of military history. "Threw himself between German machine gun fire and a squad of wounded soldiers. Saved 8 lives, lost his own." Devon's sketchpad slipped from nerveless fingers. "That's impossible. My grandfather died in a car accident when I was little. My parents never said anything about—" "Sometimes families bury painful truths to protect the next generation," Morrison said gently. "But honor has a way of surfacing eventually. It's in your blood, son. The question is what you choose to do with it." Across the room, Marcus found himself in an unexpected conversation with Tyler. The teenager's natural leadership was evident even in defeat, but it reminded Marcus uncomfortably of his own troubled son, intelligent, angry, misdirected. You remind me of someone, Marcus said, his contractor's calloused hands cradling a coffee cup. Kid about your age, thinks the world owes him something, too smart for his own good. Tyler's defensive walls started rising. Yeah? What happened to him? He's my son, and I failed him the same way your father failed you. The admission came harder than Marcus expected. Difference is, I'm still here, still trying to figure out how to reach him. Your father gave up and walked away. Maybe he was smart, Tyler said bitterly. Maybe staying just prolongs the disappointment. Marcus studied the 17-year-old, seeing past the anger to the pain beneath. You know what I learned in combat? The hardest battles aren't against the enemy, they're against giving up. Your father chose surrender. Question is, are you going to make the same choice? Tyler was quiet for a long moment. What would staying look like for someone like me? Hard work, daily discipline, learning that leadership means serving others, not just getting your way. Marcus's voice carried the authority of experience. It means understanding that real strength comes from building others up, not tearing things down. Meanwhile, Izzy sat transfixed as Hank shared photo albums filled with faces young and old, soldiers who'd served across 7 decades of American conflicts. Each photograph told a story of sacrifice, brotherhood, and the terrible cost of freedom. This was Sergeant Rodriguez, Hank said, pointing to a young Latino soldier grinning at the camera. Marcus's father died pulling 3 wounded men to safety in Vietnam. Marcus was only 10 when we had to tell him his dad wasn't coming home. Izzy thought of her own father, working double shifts to support the family, sacrificing his health for their stability. Marcus grew up without his father too. Military families understand sacrifice differently, Hank explained. We don't just lose people in combat, we lose them to duty, to service, to something bigger than ourselves. But that sacrifice only means something if the next generation learns from it. What am I supposed to learn? Izzy asked, her tough exterior finally cracking. That my anger doesn't matter? That our problems aren't real? Hank's weathered hand covered hers. You're supposed to learn that your anger is real, your problems matter, but destruction isn't the answer. These soldiers, he gestured at the photographs, they were angry too, angry at injustice, at loss, at a world that seemed broken, but they channeled that anger into protecting something, building something, becoming something. As evening shadows lengthened, the conversations deepened. Devon learned that artistic vision, combined with military precision, could create memorials that truly honored the fallen. Tyler discovered that leadership meant responsibility to others, not just personal advancement. Izzy began understanding. That strength came from building up community, not tearing down symbols. Sarah Chen watched the transformation with professional amazement. She'd facilitated hundreds of restorative justice sessions, but rarely had she seen such rapid emotional breakthrough. The combination of genuine remorse, personal connection, and meaningful challenge was creating something unprecedented. But the real moment of transformation came when Hank opened a special album, photographs of the Memorial Garden's construction, pictures of him and Margaret planting each section, choosing plants, placing markers. The teenagers saw the love, care, and reverence that had gone into creating what they'd destroyed. This is what we ruined, Devon whispered, tears flowing freely. Not just flowers, a love story, a family history. Every memorial is a love story, Hank said quietly. Love for fallen friends, love for family, love for country. When you destroyed my garden, you didn't just hurt me. You broke the physical expression of all that love. Tyler looked around at the Rangers, seeing them not as intimidating military figures, but as men carrying their own grief, their own love for the fallen. How do we fix it? How do we rebuild love? Morrison leaned forward, his instructor's instincts engaging. You start by understanding what you're building. Each plant, each marker, each design element has to honor not just the soldier who died, but the family who mourns, the brothers who remember, the community that benefits from their sacrifice. That means research, Marcus added, learning about each soldier personally. Their lives, their dreams, their families, their deaths only tell part of the story. You need to understand what they live for. Devon's hand moved instinctively toward his sketch pad. Could we create something more than just a garden? Something that tells their whole stories? Now you're thinking like a leader, Hank said, approval evident in his voice. Not just replacing what was broken, but building something better, something that teaches others what these men meant. As the evening drew to a close, the teenagers prepared to leave with homework assignments that would have been unimaginable 24 hours earlier. Research specific soldiers, interview families, design memorial elements that honored individual lives, rather than just replacing destroyed plants. Tyler paused at the door, looking back at Hank. Why are you giving us this chance, after what we did? Hank's answer came slowly, weighted with decades of hard-earned wisdom. Because Margaret always said the strongest memorial isn't made of stone or flowers, it's made of changed lives. If helping you become the people you're meant to be honors my fallen friends, then their sacrifice continues to matter. The teenagers, left carrying more than guilt, they carried purpose, direction, and the beginning of understanding what it meant to build something worthy of protection. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time since the destruction, hope walked alongside them into the night. The strongest memorial isn't made of stone or flowers, it's made of changed lives. Hank's words echoed in Tyler's mind as he stood in Millbrook's public library 3 days later, surrounded by military records, newspaper clippings, and photographs that painted a portrait of heroism he'd never bothered to understand. His assignment was Corporal Rodriguez, Marcus's father, the young soldier who died pulling wounded men to safety in Vietnam. But the more Tyler learned, the more he realized he wasn't just researching a soldier's death, he was discovering how a life of service could echo across generations. Rodriguez, age 22, posthumous Bronze Star recipient. Tyler read aloud to Devon, who sat nearby sketching memorial design concepts. Left behind a wife, Maria, and 10-year-old son, Marcus. Tyler paused, imagining a boy his age learning his father would never come home. Says here he'd been planning to start a construction business when he got back, wanted to build affordable housing for veterans. Devon looked up from his drawing. Marcus is in construction now. Think that's coincidence? Tyler studied the photograph of Rodriguez. Young, determined, wearing the same expression of quiet leadership Tyler recognized. In Marcus, maybe we carry more of our parents than we think. Across the library, Izzy researched Sergeant Mike Kowalski with Mrs. Kowalski herself, the elderly woman's presence both blessing and burden. Ruth's memories of her son were vivid, painful, and necessary. Michael always said he'd rather die, protecting others, than live knowing he could have helped and didn't, Ruth said, her weathered hands touching a photo of her boy in dress blues. When that grenade landed near his squad, he didn't hesitate, just threw himself on it like it was the most natural thing in the world. Izzy struggled to reconcile the heroic figure in the stories with the teenage boy grinning in family photos. Michael had been only 19 when he died, barely older than she was now. What was he like before, when he was just your son? Ruth's smile carried decades of love and loss, stubborn, protective of anyone smaller or weaker, got in trouble at school for fighting bullies but never started a fight himself. She paused, studying Izzy's face. Remind you of anyone? The parallel hit Izzy like a physical blow. Her own protective instincts, her willingness to fight for friends, her tough exterior hiding deeper insecurities. She was looking at a mirror across time and gender. How do you live with losing someone like that? You honor their choice by becoming worthy of their sacrifice, Ruth said simply. Michael died protecting people. The question is, what are you going to protect? Meanwhile, Devon worked with Morrison at the kitchen table in Hank's house, learning that memorial design required understanding not just individual sacrifice, but collective memory. His assignment was Lieutenant David Wright, his own grandfather, the Normandy hero whose existence had been hidden from him his entire life. Your parents weren't lying to protect themselves, Morrison explained, spreading out military records and photographs Devon had never seen. They were trying to protect you from the weight of legacy. Some families bury military service because the expectation feels crushing. Devon studied a photograph of his grandfather, young, serious, wearing lieutenant's bars with obvious pride. The resemblance was unmistakable, not just in features but in the intensity of expression Devon recognized from his own mirror. What was he like? Artistic, actually. Drew tactical sketches that were works of art themselves. Had a gift for seeing battlefields as compositions, understanding how terrain, enemy positions and friendly forces created patterns that could be read and exploited. Morrison pulled out sketches from military files, detailed drawings that took Devon's breath away. Sound familiar? The sketches were beautiful, precise, purposeful, combining artistic vision with tactical necessity. Devon saw his own artistic instincts reflected in drawings made 70 years ago by a grandfather he'd never known existed. He died leading a charge to save wounded soldiers, Morrison continued. Could have stayed safe, but saw men in trouble and chose to act. His last radio transmission was coordinates for enemy positions, drawn as he died. Devon's hands shook as he traced his grandfather's sketches. Why didn't my parents tell me? Because they were afraid you'd feel obligated to live up to something. Impossible. But obligation and inspiration are different things. Your grandfather's courage doesn't obligate you to die heroically. It inspires you to live courageously. As the research phase continued, the teenagers discovered that heroism wasn't abstract concept, but human choice made by people not unlike themselves. Eddie Rodriguez had been a young father worried about providing for his family. Michael Kowalski had been a teenager who hated bullies. David Wright had been an artist who saw beauty even in warfare. The rebuilding began the following weekend, but it looked nothing like traditional community service. Each teenager had become expert in their assigned soldier's life story, and their memorial sections reflected deep understanding rather than superficial replacement. Tyler worked alongside Marcus, learning that construction was both practical skill and form of honor. Your father wanted to build affordable housing, Tyler said, carefully placing stones around Eddie's marigold bed. Were you trying to continue his work? Marcus paused in his digging, considering the question. Maybe, never thought about it consciously, but he gestured at the careful construction taking shape. Building things that last, that serve people. Yeah, maybe I was trying to finish what he started. Devon's artistic vision transformed his grandfather's memorial into something unprecedented. Instead of simple flower bed, he designed an interactive display featuring reproductions of David Wright's tactical sketches alongside explanations of artistic elements in military planning. Visitors could understand how beauty and strategy intersected in wartime leadership. Your grandfather would be proud, Morrison said, watching Devon explain sketch techniques to curious neighbors. You're showing people that warriors can be artists, that courage and creativity aren't opposites. Izzy's work with Mrs. Kowalski created the memorial's emotional centerpiece, a bench positioned where visitors could sit among Michael's white roses while reading stories from soldiers' families. The design encouraged reflection, conversation, and connection across generations. Michael always brought people together, Ruth observed, watching Izzy coordinate volunteer efforts with natural leadership. Looks like his memorial is doing the same thing. But the real transformation wasn't happening in the garden. It was happening in the relationships. Tyler discovered that leadership meant serving others rather than commanding them. Devon learned that artistic vision could honor memory while inspiring future. Izzy found that strength meant building community rather than defending against it. Hank watched the work progress with quiet satisfaction, seeing Margaret's vision fulfilled in ways neither of them had imagined. The memorial garden was becoming more than tribute to fallen soldiers. It was becoming classroom for living ones. "What do you think, Maggie?" he whispered to the blue delphinium bed. "Are we building something worthy?" The afternoon breeze stirred the flowers like gentle approval, and Hank smiled for the first time since the destruction. The garden was growing again, but this time it was growing guardians as well as flowers. The garden was growing again, but this time it was growing guardians as well as flowers. 3 weeks into the restoration, Millbrook had begun to take notice. What started as teenage vandalism, followed by military intervention, had evolved into something the small town had never seen. A genuine partnership between generations that seemed to be transforming everyone involved. But transformation doesn't happen without resistance. "This is ridiculous," Janet Morrison announced at Tuesday's town council meeting, her voice carrying the indignation of someone who believed in simple justice. "Those kids destroyed private property. They should be in juvenile detention, not playing in gardens and getting praised for cleaning up their own mess." Her sentiment echoed throughout the packed meeting room. Several parents nodded agreement, their own children having faced consequences for far lesser infractions. The idea that vandalism could lead to mentorship instead of punishment struck many as fundamentally unfair. "They traumatized an elderly veteran," added Bob Fletcher, whose son Jake had been part of the destruction but hadn't shown the same commitment to restoration. "My boy comes home talking about honor and sacrifice like he's some kind of war hero. These kids aren't heroes, they're criminals who got lucky." Sarah Chen stood to address the concerns, her social worker training helping her navigate the community's conflicted emotions. "What we're seeing isn't luck, it's restorative justice in action. These teenagers are learning more about responsibility, service, and community through this process than they would through traditional punishment." "But what about accountability?" Janet pressed. "What message does this send to other kids? That you can destroy whatever you want as long as you're sorry afterward?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Even Hank, sitting in the front row beside the Brotherhood, felt the weight of community skepticism. 3 weeks of progress could be undone if Millbrook decided the teenagers hadn't earned their second chance. Tyler Mackenzie stood up, his movement causing conversations to halt. At 17, he'd never addressed a town council meeting, but leadership sometimes required stepping into uncomfortable spaces. "Mrs. Morrison, you're right to be angry," Tyler said, his voice steady despite visible nervousness. "We broke something, precious and irreplaceable. We hurt Mr. Patterson and disrespected the memory of fallen soldiers. Traditional punishment would have been easier, for us and for you." He paused, looking around the room at faces ranging from curious to hostile. "But easy doesn't create change. Spending 6 months in detention would have taught us to be more careful about getting caught, not more thoughtful about our choices. What we're doing now, researching soldiers' lives, building memorials that honor their sacrifices, working alongside veterans who could have chosen revenge but offered redemption instead, this is harder than any punishment you could imagine." Devon Wright joined his friend, his artist's sensitivity reading the room's emotional undercurrents. "Every day we face the families of soldiers we dishonored. Mrs. Kowalski could hate us for destroying her son's memorial, but instead she teaches Izzy what Michael died protecting. Captain Morrison could punish me for vandalizing a memorial to his father, but instead he's showing me how my grandfather's courage can inspire art that honors service. Words are cheap, Bob Fletcher interrupted. How do we know this isn't just an act? How do we know you won't go back to causing trouble once the cameras stop rolling? Isabella Santos rose slowly, her tough exterior still intact but tempered by weeks of genuine growth. Because we've seen what we're capable of building, and it's better than anything we were capable of destroying. Her voice carried the conviction of someone who'd discovered purpose. 3 weeks ago, I was angry at a world that didn't seem to care about kids like us. Now I understand that the world cares exactly as much as we're willing to contribute to it. The teenagers' defense of their transformation was passionate, but might not have swayed the skeptical crowd if Marcus Rodriguez hadn't stood to speak. His presence commanded immediate attention, the respect accorded to someone who'd served, sacrificed, and earned his place in the community. I came to Millbrook ready for war, Marcus said simply. These kids had desecrated a memorial to my father, attacked my sergeant, violated something sacred to the Brotherhood. Everything in my training said they deserved swift, harsh justice. He looked at Tyler, Devon, and Izzy with an expression that mixed pride and surprise. But Hank taught us that the strongest response isn't always the harshest one. These teenagers have worked harder in 3 weeks than most adults work in 3 months. They've researched military history, interviewed veterans' families, designed memorials that honor sacrifice in ways that will teach future generations. Captain Morrison joined Marcus at the front of the room. The question isn't whether they deserve redemption. The question is whether we're strong enough to offer it. These kids made a terrible mistake, but they're becoming the kind of people we need. Leaders who understand service, artists who honor memory, citizens who build instead of destroy. Mrs. Kowalski surprised everyone by speaking next. At 72, her voice still carried the authority of someone who'd raised children and buried heroes. My Michael died protecting people he didn't even know. If I can't forgive 3 kids who've spent weeks honoring his memory, then what was his sacrifice worth? The room's energy shifted as other veterans began standing in support. Brad Williams, Patricia's brother and Marcus's Brotherhood member, spoke about the teenagers' dedication. Tommy Reeves described Tyler's natural leadership being channeled toward positive goals. David Chen praised Devon's artistic vision for the memorial displays. But the moment that truly changed minds came when Hank Patterson slowly rose to address the community he'd served for decades. This isn't about whether these kids deserve forgiveness, Hank said, his 87-year-old voice carrying across the silent room. This is about what kind of community we choose to be. Do we want to be people who respond to mistakes with nothing but punishment? Or do we want to be people who transform mistakes into opportunities for growth? He gestured toward the teenagers. These kids destroyed my memorial garden and it broke my heart, but they've built something better in its place. Not just flowers and stone, but understanding between generations. They've learned what sacrifice means, what service costs, what honor requires. They've become protectors instead of destroyers. Hank's voice strengthened with passion. Every soldier honored in that garden died believing in America's promise that people can change, grow, become better than their worst moments. If we deny these kids the chance to prove their transformation, we deny everything those soldiers died defending. The vote, when it came, wasn't close. The town council unanimously approved the Teenagers' Community Service Program, endorsing the expansion of veteran mentorship initiatives to other at-risk youth. More importantly, Millbrook chose hope over cynicism, believing in the possibility of redemption. As the meeting ended, Tyler approached Mrs. Morrison with visible nervousness. "Ma'am, I understand why you're angry. If I were your neighbor, I'd probably feel the same way. But I hope someday we can earn your respect through our actions, not just our words. Janet Morrison studied the young man for a long moment, seeing something in his bearing that reminded her of her own son at that age, before life had hardened him, before opportunities had narrowed. "Actions," she said finally. "Show me actions, and we'll see." Outside the community center, the brotherhood gathered around their young charges, pride evident in their faces. The teenagers had faced community skepticism with courage, defending their transformation without minimizing their original offense. That was real leadership, Marcus told Tyler, standing up for what's right when it's hard, when people are watching, when failure means losing everything you've worked for. Devon looked at his memorial sketches, seeing them differently now. "We're not just rebuilding a garden anymore, are we? We're trying to rebuild trust." "Trust has to be earned daily," Morrison replied, "through consistent choices, sustained effort, and the willingness to prove yourself over and over again." As they walked back toward Hank's house and the memorial garden that had become the center of their transformed lives, Izzy asked the question weighing on all their minds. What happens when the project is finished, when the garden is complete, and the ceremonies are over? Hank's answer came without hesitation. Then the real work begins. Building something is just the start. Protecting it, maintaining it, using it to teach others. That's what lasts. The deeper roots were taking hold, spreading beyond flowers into the foundation of character itself. The deeper roots were taking hold, spreading beyond flowers into the foundation of character itself. 6 weeks after the destruction, Millbrook's memorial garden stood transformed, not just restored, but elevated into something greater than it had ever been. The dedication ceremony, on this crisp October morning, would test whether private transformation could withstand public scrutiny. Cars lined Elm Street as visitors arrived from across the state. Veterans organizations, military families, local officials, and curious community members gathered around the garden that had become a symbol of redemption. News crews positioned cameras to capture what many considered an unprecedented example of restorative justice in action. Hank Patterson stood at the garden's entrance, wearing his dress uniform for the first time in 5 years. The Korean War. Veterans' medals caught the morning light, each ribbon representing battles fought and brothers lost. But today, his focus wasn't on past conflicts. It was on future possibilities. "Nervous?" Marcus asked, adjusting his own dress blues. The Brotherhood had assembled in full military bearing, their presence lending gravity to the occasion while supporting the teenagers who'd become their unlikely protégés. "Proud," Hank replied simply. Margaret would have loved seeing this. The ceremony began with Tyler Mackenzie stepping to the podium, his 17-year-old frame carrying authority that would have been impossible 6 weeks earlier. The angry, misdirected teenager who'd led the destruction had evolved into a young man capable of leading restoration. 6 weeks ago, I stood in this garden as a vandal, Tyler began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I saw beautiful flowers and perfect landscaping, and I hated what I thought it represented, privilege I couldn't have, stability I couldn't achieve, a future that seemed closed to people like me. He paused, looking toward the memorial section dedicated to Eddie Rodriguez. But I was wrong about everything. This wasn't a symbol of privilege. It was a testament to sacrifice. These weren't decorations for a perfect life. They were tributes to imperfect people who chose to protect others instead of themselves. Tyler's voice strengthened with conviction. Corporal Eddie Rodriguez was 22 when he died pulling wounded soldiers to safety in Vietnam. He left behind a wife, a 10-year-old son, and dreams of building affordable housing for veterans. He never got to fulfill those dreams, but his son Marcus carries them forward every day through his construction work, his mentorship, and his commitment to building things that matter. Udis, The crowd listened intently as Tyler detailed Eddie's life, his sacrifice, and the ripple effects of his courage across generations. This wasn't the perfunctory speech of community service. It was the passionate testimony of someone who'd discovered that heroism wasn't abstract, but intensely personal. Devon Wright followed, his artistic sensitivity evident as he unveiled the memorial's new centerpiece, an interactive display featuring his grandfather's tactical sketches alongside modern interpretations that connected military strategy to artistic vision. Lieutenant David Wright was my grandfather, though I only learned this 6 weeks ago, Devon said, his voice carrying wonder at the discovery. He died at Normandy, leading a charge to save wounded soldiers, but he lived as an artist who saw beauty even in warfare. His tactical sketches were works of art that saved lives through precision and creativity. Devon gestured toward the display cases containing reproductions of his grandfather's work. These drawings show that warriors can be artists, that courage and creativity aren't opposites, but partners. My grandfather used artistic vision to understand battlefields and save lives. I want to use artistic vision to understand sacrifice and honor memory. And the presentation was masterful, combining historical education with personal revelation, showing visitors how individual sacrifice connected to broader themes of service and artistic expression. Devon had transformed from follower to teacher, using his gifts to illuminate truths others might miss. Isabella Santos approached the podium last, her tough exterior now channeled toward protective purpose rather than defensive aggression. She spoke about Sergeant Mike Kowalski with the passion of someone who'd found a cause worth fighting for. Michael Kowalski was 19 when he threw himself on a grenade to save his squad in Afghanistan, Izzy said, her voice carrying the strength her grandmother had always taught her. He died protecting people he'd known for months, not years, but protection wasn't about duration of relationship, it was about depth of commitment. She gestured toward the memorial bench, positioned among Michael's white roses. This bench isn't just for sitting, it's for listening, Mrs. Kowalski and other military families will share stories here, helping visitors understand that every soldier was someone's child, someone's hope for the future. Michael died protecting strangers, but his memory protects all of us by teaching what sacrifice really means. Izzy's presentation revealed the memorial's deeper purpose, not just honoring the dead, but educating the living about the cost of freedom and the value of service. Her transformation from angry teenager to community protector was evident in every word, but the ceremony's most powerful moment came when Mrs. Kowalski rose to speak, her 72-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who'd buried a hero. My Michael died believing in second chances, she said simply. He protected people who'd made mistakes, fought for soldiers who'd gotten lost, saved lives that might have been wasted without his sacrifice. If I can't offer second chances to kids who've spent 6 weeks honoring his memory, then I've failed to understand what he died defending. Her endorsement carried weight that no military official or community leader could match. The blessing of someone who'd paid the ultimate price for freedom and chose grace over grudges. Hank Patterson concluded the ceremony with words that would be quoted in newspapers across the state. This garden began as my private memorial to fallen friends. It became a public testament to the power of redemption. These teenagers destroyed something precious, but they built something even more valuable. Proof that America's promise of transformation isn't just political rhetoric, but personal reality. He looked at Tyler, Devon, and Izzy with obvious pride. Every soldier honored here died believing people could change, grow, become better than their worst moments. These kids have vindicated that faith. They've shown that destruction doesn't have to be final, that mistakes don't have to be permanent, that the strongest response to hate is the courage to build love. The ceremony concluded with the formal dedication of the expanded Memorial Garden and the announcement of the Millbrook Veterans Mentorship Program, a permanent initiative pairing at-risk youth with military veterans for ongoing guidance and support. What had begun as punishment for 5 teenagers had evolved into a model for community healing that would serve future generations. As crowds dispersed, the brotherhood gathered around their young charges, pride evident in their faces. The teenagers had faced their largest audience yet, defending their transformation while honoring the soldiers they'd once dishonored. That was real leadership, Morrison told Tyler. Speaking truth to power, even when the truth makes you vulnerable. Devon studied the visitors, examining his grandfather's sketches, seeing strangers discover connections between art and military service. People are actually learning. The memorial isn't just decoration, it's education. Wheezy watched Mrs. Kowalski guide visitors to Michael's bench, beginning conversations about sacrifice and service that would continue long after the ceremony ended. We're not just honoring the past anymore, we're protecting the future. Marcus placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder as they watched the garden filled with respectful visitors rather than destructive vandals. Your father walked away when things got difficult, but you stayed and did the hard work of becoming someone worth respecting. That's the difference between weakness and strength. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the memorial garden, Hank sat on Margaret's bench, surrounded by blue delphiniums, and the knowledge that their shared vision had exceeded their wildest dreams. The garden honored the dead, while teaching the living, connected generations through shared understanding of sacrifice, and proved that the strongest memorial isn't built of stone, but of transformed hearts. The dedication was complete, but the real test was just beginning. Could this transformation sustain itself beyond ceremony and media attention? Could these relationships survive the pressures of normal life? Could redemption prove permanent, or would it fade like flowers at winter's approach? Time would tell, but for this perfect October day, hope had triumphed over despair, building had conquered destruction, and 5 teenagers had become guardians of memory rather than agents of chaos. The garden was complete, but its guardians were just beginning to grow. The garden was complete, but its guardians were just beginning to grow. 6 months after the dedication ceremony, Tyler Mackenzie stood in a conference room 200 miles from Millbrook, addressing a panel of juvenile justice officials who'd traveled from across the region to study what media had dubbed the Millbrook model. And at 18 now, Tyler carried himself with the confident bearing of someone who'd discovered purpose through service. But success brought pressures he hadn't anticipated. Requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and program consultations had transformed him from anonymous teenager into reluctant public figure. The key isn't punishment or forgiveness, Tyler explained to the attentive officials. It's meaningful connection between offense and restoration. We didn't just clean up our mess. We learned about the people we'd hurt, understood what we'd destroyed, and committed to protecting something larger than ourselves. The questions came rapidly. How long did the transformation take? Could the model work with violent offenders? What role did military mentorship play versus civilian guidance? Tyler answered with the expertise of someone who'd lived the process, but part of him missed the simpler days when his only responsibility was tending Eddie Rodriguez's marigolds. Back in Millbrook, Devon Wright faced his own complications. Art. Schools across the country had taken notice of his memorial designs, offering scholarships that would launch his career but take him far from the garden that had shaped his identity. Success felt like betrayal. How could he leave the place that had saved him? Opportunities like this don't come twice, his parents argued, displaying acceptance letters from prestigious institutions. You can't spend your life maintaining a memorial garden. But Devon struggled with the assumption that moving forward meant moving away. His grandfather's sketches had taught him that art could serve purposes beyond personal expression. It could honor memory, educate communities, and bridge generational divides. Was abandoning those responsibilities the price of artistic success? The answer came during his weekly session with Captain Morrison, who'd become more than mentor. He'd become the father figure Devon had never known he needed. "Your grandfather faced the same choice at Normandy," Morrison said, studying Devon's latest sketches for expanding the memorial program to other communities. He could have stayed safe, protected his artistic future, avoided the risk that killed him. Instead, he chose service over safety. "Are you saying I should turn down the scholarships?" Morrison's response carried the weight of military wisdom. "I'm saying true artistry isn't about where you create, it's about what you create and why. Your grandfather's greatest masterpiece wasn't a painting, it was the lives he saved through tactical precision. Your masterpiece might not be gallery exhibitions, but transformed communities." The conversation crystallized Devon's understanding of his path. He could pursue traditional artistic success or pioneer something unprecedented, using art to honor military sacrifice while healing community divisions. The choice felt less like limitation than liberation. Meanwhile, Isabella Santos discovered that protecting others had become her defining characteristic, but not everyone welcomed her protective instincts. Her parents, working multiple jobs to support the family, struggled to understand their daughter's commitment to veteran mentorship and memorial maintenance. "You spend more time with old soldiers than your own family," her mother complained after Izzy missed another family dinner to help with the veterans program. "This isn't your responsibility." But Izzy had learned that responsibility wasn't assigned, it was chosen. The teenagers she now mentored, kids whose anger mirrored her own 6 months earlier, needed someone who understood their struggles while offering better choices. Michael Kowalski was 19 when he died protecting strangers, Izzy reminded her parents. "I'm 17 and I'm protecting my community." "How is that wrong?" Her grandmother's support provided the anchor Izzy needed. "Mija, some people are born to build walls, others to tear them down, but the rarest ones build bridges. You're becoming a bridge." The bridge metaphor proved prophetic. When Izzy encountered her first major test, a group of teenagers from a neighboring town had vandalized their local war memorial, and community leaders wanted to implement the Millbrook model. But these kids were harder, angrier from circumstances that made Tyler's struggles seem manageable. "They're not like you were," the police chief warned during Izzy's first meeting with the vandals. "These kids have records, gang connections, family situations that make intervention dangerous." Izzy studied the 5 teenagers sitting across from her, defensive, hostile, convinced the world had already written them off. She saw herself 6 months earlier, but magnified by circumstances she'd been fortunate to avoid. "You're right," she told the police chief. "They're harder cases than we were, which means they need help more, not less." The challenge of mentoring, teens who made her former group look angelic, forced Izzy to develop skills she hadn't known she possessed. Leadership wasn't just about protecting, it was about inspiring others to protect themselves. Back in Millbrook, Marcus Rodriguez faced his own crossroads. The success of the mentorship program had attracted attention from military contractors who wanted to hire him for larger-scale veteran integration programs. The opportunity represented career advancement and financial security, but it would mean leaving the community where he'd discovered his true calling. "It's a good problem to have," Hank told him during their weekly garden maintenance session. "Success creating opportunities you hadn't imagined." Marcus pruned Eddie's marigolds. With practiced care, these weekly rituals having become meditation as much as maintenance. "Part of me thinks I owe it to my father's memory to take the bigger opportunity. Build something that helps more veterans nationwide. And the other part? The other part remembers that my father died protecting specific people in a specific place. Maybe the biggest impact isn't always the broadest impact. Hank's response came slowly, weighted with decades of leadership experience. Your father saved 3 soldiers that day in Vietnam, 3 specific lives, 3 families that went home, 3 futures that continued because of his sacrifice. Sometimes the most important work is measured in individual transformations, not statistical aggregates. The wisdom resonated beyond Marcus's career decision. The Millbrook model was being studied, replicated, and scaled across multiple states. But its true success lay in 5 specific teenagers who'd been transformed from destroyers into guardians. As winter approached, the memorial garden entered dormancy, but the relationships it had fostered continued growing. Tyler's speaking engagements were teaching him that leadership meant inspiring others to find their own paths rather than simply following his. Devon's choice to attend local college while developing memorial art programs regionally proved that service and ambition weren't mutually exclusive. Izzy's work with harder cases was building skills that would serve her throughout life, regardless of career path. But the program's expansion brought unexpected challenges. Media attention attracted political interest, with lawmakers wanting to mandate restorative justice programs without understanding the deep relationship work that made transformation possible. Grant funding came with bureaucratic requirements that threatened to institutionalize what had succeeded through personal connection. We're in danger of becoming a program instead of a family, Morrison warned during a Brotherhood meeting. Success is attracting people who want to package what we do without understanding why it works. The observation proved prescient when state officials proposed standardizing the Millbrook model with curriculum requirements, assessment metrics, and certification processes that would eliminate the flexibility that made personal transformation possible. Tyler found himself in the unexpected position of defending their informal approach against well-meaning bureaucrats who wanted to improve it through systematization. You can't standardize redemption, he told a legislative committee studying juvenile justice reform. You can't create a curriculum for discovering purpose or establish metrics for measuring character growth. What happened to us worked because it was personal, flexible, and based on relationships rather than regulations. The fight to maintain the program's integrity while expanding its reach became a new kind of battle, one requiring political skills none of them had expected to need. But the lessons learned from military mentors served them well. Understand your mission, protect what matters, and never compromise core values for convenience. As the first anniversary of the destruction approached, the 5 teenagers had become young adults carrying responsibilities they'd never imagined. Their transformation from vandals to guardians was complete, but their real test lay ahead, proving that change could endure beyond crisis, that growth could continue without constant supervision, and that the seeds planted in crisis could bear fruit for generations. The garden slept beneath winter snow, but its guardians worked through the season, tending relationships and protecting memories that would bloom again when spring returned. The garden slept beneath winter snow, but its guardians worked through the season, tending relationships and protecting memories that would bloom again when spring returned. 1 year to the day after the destruction, Hank Patterson woke before dawn with chest pains that sent him to Millbrook General Hospital, where doctors discovered what time inevitably brings to 88-year-old hearts. It's not immediately life-threatening, Dr. Sarah Kim explained to the assembled Brotherhood in the hospital waiting room. But his heart is wearing out. Could be months, could be years, but the clock is ticking. The news hit Marcus like enemy fire, sudden, devastating, threatening to destroy everything they'd built around Hank's steady presence. The old sergeant had been their North Star for decades, the anchor that kept them grounded in civilian life. Without him, would the Brotherhood hold together? Would the mentorship program survive? Tyler received the call while preparing for his final high school presentation about restorative justice. At 18, he'd been accepted to 3 universities with scholarships earned through his transformation story. But Hank's hospitalization put everything in perspective. Academic success meant nothing if he lost the man who'd taught him what leadership actually meant. "How bad is it?" Tyler asked Marcus, driving toward the hospital despite the late hour. "Bad enough that we need to have conversations we've been avoiding," Marcus replied, "about what happens next, about who carries on what Hank started." The hospital room filled gradually with the people Hank had shaped, rangers who'd driven cross-country, teenagers who'd found purpose through his guidance, community members who'd witnessed transformation through his wisdom. Mrs. Kowalski sat beside his bed, holding the hand of a man who'd become family across decades of shared grief and mutual support. "Stop looking like I'm already dead," Hank grumbled from his hospital bed, though his voice carried none of its usual strength. "Heart problems aren't necessarily death sentences, just reminders that time isn't infinite." Devon had been sketching in the corner, his artist's instincts capturing the scene while processing emotions too complex for words. "What happens to the garden, to the program, to everything we've built together?" Hank's answer came slowly, measured against the beeping monitors and whispered conversations of night shift nurses. "What happens is what always happens when something matters. Other people step up to protect it. The question isn't whether the work continues, but who has the courage to carry it forward." His eyes moved around the room, taking inventory of the lives he'd influenced. "Tyler, you've learned that real leadership means serving others rather than commanding them. Devon, you've discovered that art can honor memory while inspiring future generations. Izzy, you've become the bridge builder your grandmother knew you could be." The old veteran's gaze settled on Marcus. "And you've learned that the strongest way to honor your father isn't trying to replace him, but using his example to become who you're meant to be." As dawn broke over Millbrook, bringing the first anniversary of the destruction, Hank was released from the hospital with medications and warnings, but also with clear purpose. His mortality had concentrated everyone's attention on legacy, not just preserving what existed, but ensuring it could evolve and grow. The anniversary memorial service that afternoon drew the largest crowd yet, but its tone differed from previous ceremonies. Instead of celebrating past transformation, speakers focused on future commitment. The teenagers had become young adults, the mentorship program had expanded to 5 states, and the garden had inspired similar projects across the country. But the real test came 3 weeks later, when news reached Millbrook that teenagers in Riverside, a town 50 miles south, had vandalized their veteran memorial with graffiti and broken headstones. Local officials wanted to implement harsh punishment, but veterans' families requested the Millbrook approach. "They want you to go," Marcus told Tyler, who'd been accepted to a university program in public administration. "Lead the intervention team. Show them how restoration can work better than retribution." Tyler felt the weight of Hank's legacy settling on his shoulders. At 18, he was being asked to teach others what he'd learned through his own failures. The irony wasn't lost on him. The kid who'd once destroyed a memorial was now being called to help restore another. What if I can't reach them? What if they're too angry, too damaged, too far gone? Hank's response came from his easy chair in the memorial garden, where he now spent afternoons supervising rather than participating in maintenance work. "Everyone's too far gone until they're not. You were too far gone once. Izzy was too far gone. Devon was too far gone. The only difference between redeemable and irredeemable is whether someone's willing to do the hard work of redemption." The Riverside intervention became Tyler's final test before graduation. He assembled a team including Devon, whose memorial had become nationally recognized, Izzy, whose mentoring skills worked even with the hardest cases, and select Brotherhood members. Their approach combined everything they'd learned: personal connection, meaningful research assignments, and the gradual revelation that destruction was easier than construction, but far less satisfying. The Riverside Vandals proved more challenging than the original Millbrook group. These kids came from broken homes, had gang connections, and carried anger that made Tyler's teenage frustration seem manageable. But the principles remained constant: understand what was destroyed, learn about the people harmed, commit to building something better. "You think you know us," the lead vandal, a 16-year-old named Carlos, challenged Tyler during their first meeting. Rich kid playing poor kid, pretending you understand what real anger feels like. Tyler's response surprised everyone, including himself. "You're right. I don't know your specific anger, but I know what it feels like to believe the world has written you off, to think destruction is the only power you have left, to assume that breaking things is easier than fixing them." He gestured toward Devon, who was sketching the vandalized memorial. "We're not here to judge you or save you. We're here to show you what we learned when we made the same mistakes you're making. The choice to change is yours. We're just offering tools if you want to use them." The Riverside project took 6 months, testing every lesson learned in Millbrook. Carlos and his crew proved that transformation was possible even under the hardest circumstances, but it required patience, persistence, and the willingness to fail and start again multiple times. When Tyler returned to Millbrook for his high school graduation, he carried news that would define his future. The Riverside success had attracted attention from the Department of Justice, which wanted to fund a national program training young people in restorative justice techniques. Tyler would direct the initiative, turning his transformation story into a career dedicated to helping others find their own redemption. "Proud of you, son," Hank said, watching Tyler receive his diploma with scholarships earned through service, rather than academics. "Your father walked away when things got hard. You stayed and did the work that matters." Devon announced his own decision that same day, accepting a position developing memorial art programs for the National Park Service while maintaining his base in Millbrook. His grandfather's legacy would live through installations that honored military sacrifice while teaching artistic principles. Izzy revealed her plan to study social work while continuing her mentoring programs, having discovered that her protective instincts could serve entire communities rather than just individual friends. Her grandmother's stories about bridge building had become her professional calling. As summer approached, bringing the 2nd anniversary of the original destruction, Hank faced the reality that his direct involvement would necessarily diminish. But watching Tyler lead the Riverside intervention, Devon's national recognition for memorial art, and Izzy's expanding mentorship network proved that legacy lived through influence rather than presence. The final scene played out in the memorial garden on a perfect June evening. 5 young adults, Tyler, Devon, Izzy, and the Riverside Vandals, Carlos and Maria, who'd traveled to Millbrook for the anniversary ceremony, worked alongside the Brotherhood to plant new memorial sections honoring recently fallen soldiers. Hank watched from his bench, surrounded by blue delphiniums that marked Margaret's memory and the white roses that honored Mrs. Kowalski's son. The garden had grown beyond his original vision, becoming a living classroom where destruction was transformed into creation, where anger was channeled into service, where young people learned that the strongest response to pain was the courage to heal others. "Think they'll be okay?" Mrs. Kowalski asked, settling beside him as the sun set. Over their transformed community, Hank studied the young people working in his garden, former vandals teaching current vandals how to honor military sacrifice through meaningful service, Tyler directing operations with natural authority, Devon sketching designs for future expansions. Izzy mentoring teenagers who reminded him of his own angry young soldiers decades earlier. "Better than okay," Hank replied, his voice carrying satisfaction earned through years of patient investment. "They'll be guardians." The memorial garden would endure beyond its creator, protected by people who'd learned that the strongest monuments aren't built of stone, but of transformed hearts. The cycle of destruction and redemption would continue as long as humans made mistakes and other humans had the courage to offer second chances. As stars appeared over Millbrook, 5 former vandals worked in a garden they'd once destroyed, teaching 5 current vandals how to build memorials worthy of the sacrifice they honored. The circle was complete, but the story would continue, written in changed lives, protected memories, and the endless possibility of redemption. Hank Patterson's memorial garden had become what Margaret always knew it could be, not just a tribute to the fallen, but a place where the living learned to rise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. The tit